Social Realism was the official doctrine of artistic creation in the Soviet Union. The term was first used in 1932. The doctrine was officially ratified in 1934 during the First Congress of the Writers of the USSR. Its main principles were the conveyance of communist ideology, party loyalty, and folk-minded attitude. The main criterion for the evaluation of a piece of art was its significance to the formation of socialism. The Soviet state and socialist society were required to be exalted in pieces of art, and art had to inspire and educate viewers. The positive artistic hero that embodies socialist ideals, a young, strong and optimistic Soviet person, was propagated. Abstract methods of expression were fought against, and individual touches of artists were equalized. Artists were encouraged to use visual forms which were understood by the average spectator, and were based on the classical artistic traditions and the elements of academism, naturalism and realism. After the Second World War, restrictions on art were tightened. In 1946, the Central Committee of the Communist Party approved regulations that were prepared by Stalin's comrade-in-arms Andrei Zhdanov, and that exalted realistic Russian art and prohibited the influences of Western art. The government was encouraged to take stricter measures in the regulation of art. Social Realism reached its purest expression in painting, sculpture and graphic arts from the 30s to the 50s. After Stalin's death in 1953, the restrictions were decreased. More modern artistic forms began to be tolerated, and the stylistics of pieces of art became more different. However, Social Realism remained the official style of the Soviet Union until Mikhail Gorbachev initiated perestroika in 1985. The government of the Soviet Union, which entrenched itself in Lithuania in 1944, restored the Soviet regime and extended the repressions and Sovietization of society, which encompassed all areas of life and had started during the time of the first occupation. Urban environments were formed following Soviet doctrines. Architects sent from Leningrad designed most of the new architecture. Lenin Square, which was designed by Vladislav Mikuchan and was one of the most important attributes and ideological centers of a Soviet city, was established in Vilnius between 1949 and 1952. Lenin's monument, which was created by the sculptor Nikolai Tomsky from Moscow, became the heart of the square. Buildings of the retrospective and neo-traditionalist trends which dominated in the Soviet Union began to be built. They had to attest to the greatness and triumph of the new regime. The goal was to make it so that the new buildings dominated the urban environment and became symbols of the prosperity of the Soviet state. Besides the pompous neo-traditionalist style buildings, buildings of slightly lighter stylistic trends that were of rhythmical composition and more moderate were also built during the post-war period. Lithuania's artistic life, which was discontinued during the war, did not return to progressing normally. It was chained by enforced social realism. All painters who wanted to create professionally and participate in public artistic life had to belong to the Artists' Association of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Lithuania, which was controlled by the state and was a part of the joint USSR Artists' Association. Exhibitions for different occasions designed to commemorate events in Soviet history were held most often. They needed pieces of art with certain themes, which were ordered and funded by the state. The well-formed system of orders from the state for the work of loyal artists became a profitable source of income. Quite a few demobilized soldiers of the Soviet army from Russia settled in Lithuania after the war. Some of them finished art studies, got involved in artistic life and became active creators of official art. Monuments that were visual signs of communist ideology sprung up in public places. Lenin Square, in a star-path structure with a monument of the leader in the middle of it, was obligatory in every city and town. A lot of attention was paid to memorials and graves of Soviet soldiers who were killed during the Second World War. Monuments for local Soviet heroes appeared in every region. During the period of Stalinism, a hierarchical system of genres was entrenched. Theme paintings, compositions of ideologically engaged figures on the subjects of revolutionary battles, war, work, relaxation and sports, held the highest position in this hierarchy. Not many theme paintings were created in Lithuania. The topic of war was especially important during the post-war period. The image of the Soviet army as the liberator was created, and Hitlerites were denounced. Vytautas Mackevičius' painting The Guerrillas, the painting Salomėja Nėris in the 16th Lithuanian Division by Bronė Jacevičiūtė, and Sergei Grachov's The Liberation of Klaipėda were the most famous paintings of this type. Graphic artists also created themed works of art. Domicelė Tarabildienė created an etching called Pirmieji iš rytų, the first ones from the east, and Vytautas Jurkūnas created a cycle of engravings, atrocities of Hitlerian occupants. Another important theme included images of the application of the Soviet system, illustrating the prospect of a bright future. Vincas Dilka's canvas, The Founding Meeting of a Collective Farm, was one such work. Staged realism, which was based on academic style, and artificial optimism were designed to exalt the so-called achievements and prosperity of the Soviet system. Portraiture was another important genre. Portraits of the ideological leaders of the Soviet Union held the highest hierarchical position in this respect. Representatives of the working class became specific characters of social realistic portraits. The Cold War, which started after World War II, had repercussions in art. Art had to become a strong propaganda tool. Caricatures were especially suitable for this purpose. Political caricatures were used in attempts to express in a derogatory tone the label of rotten capitalism, which was applied to the USA and all of the Western world. Real life was very different from the official Soviet rhetoric, which proclaimed a happy Soviet reality, optimistically marching towards bright communist tomorrow and the battle against rotten capitalism. Historical circumstances determined that the period before Stalin's death was the fiercest period in most artists' lives, and a decline in their creativity. About 80 artists left Lithuania for foreign countries during the war. For artists who became famous before the war, the adjustment to social realism and the spiritless unified art of the people, declaring false values, meant not only the denial of free creativity, but the denial of civil values as well. Even though the Soviets did not tolerate disloyalty and created an entire system of repressing the disobedient and encouraging the obedient, searches for compromise became hard turning points in the lives of most artists. Many of them, feeling deep sorrow, started painting themed canvases, portraits of Soviet heroes, and creating monuments. Antanas Gudaitis painted themed panoramic landscapes that were against his expressive creative nature and were done using the academic style. Justinas Vienožinskis, who painted an entire gallery of portraits of famous cultural figures of Lithuania at that time, began to portray Stalin in around 1947. However, when the Soviets began stormy discussions regarding the value of Mikalojus Konstantinas Čiurlionis' paintings, both painters were unafraid to contradict the ideological assault and defend the Lithuanian art classic blamed for formalism, decadence and cosmopolitanism. Painters and graphic artists tried to remain ideologically neutral when creating landscapes. The decorative sculpture genre was advantageous for sculptors who found themselves in this situation. However, it was not easy for them to avoid being sucked into the swirl of the system of the state orders. Alternative methods were sought. For example, the famous landscape creator Algirdas Petrulis began to create designs for candy boxes in his search for a source of income. Principles of academic naturalism started dominating arts and crafts. Arts and crafts became similar to fine arts. Ceramicists all over the Soviet Union created pompous dishes of pseudo-classical forms, which were decorated with plot compositions, and textile artists weaved portraits of people of merit and compositions of ideological figures. The work of Lithuanian ceramicists and textile workers used folk art and traditions as a starting point. It appropriated the laconic forms and ornamental embellishments. The most creative ceramicists of that time, Liudvikas Trolis and Jonas Mikėnas, mostly created dishes for daily use. Both of them followed the principle of function, form, and unity of embellishment. Lithuanian textile artists composed themed carpets by arranging scenes of figures in horizontal lines, that is, using a register method. The rhythmic patterns, color combinations, and flat composition of carpets created by Juozas Balčikonis, Vladas Daujotas, and Angelė Mironaitė remind us of folk textiles.